I hear it.
I know. I'm like, I was like, how secure are these on this? I'm checking.
Well, you know where we got them. Ithaca College never asked for them back.
Oh my God. Yeah. No, he gave them to us. Remember, they were like dead Crotallies. Well, there's 2 very good Crotallies.
Well, yeah, they're the ones we paid good money for.
Yeah.
And then there's the shitty ones. But I still assume that like the shitty ones they wanted back.
Somehow. No, he never asked them for because he said they were dead Crotallies. He didn't need them.
Huh. Gee, I wonder where the wood block is.
That
might be in the basement also.
Okay.
I mean, let me go try to find that. Need all the accoutrements.
Okay, I can do the action thing. It's actually pretty easy. It just won't make a huge sound.
What do you mean it won't make a huge sound? That's all it does is
no,
sound.
but if I go, like,
Oh, I guess that's why we put the furniture.
I was like, action.
It's a clapperboard.
That's what I wanted to.
Clapperboard.
That's what I wanted to do with
put this here. Put the rubber duck on top of it.
Yeah,
with the things that matter.
Yeah. Is it recording yet? I have no idea.
Yeah.
Oh, it's going.
Red light. It's been on.
Okay.
It's been on for a while.
Right.
Yeah. Go for it.
Action. I'll do it again. I don't know. I don't even know if this is the right
It's good.
word.
It's fine.
It's fine. I just need to not stab myself with this bowl.
Occupational hazard.
I know. Action.
And now you put it on the floor, it'll just like clatter the whole time. When we travel with all this stuff, and in the back of the car, it's just like Crotallies rattling the whole time. You're like, oh yeah, we're going to play mantra somewhere, aren't we?
Do you remember?
No. Whatever the end of that sentence is, I don't
No.
remember.
Do you? Well, first of all, should we introduce what our project is?
We're HereNowHear. I'm Ryan McCullough.
I'm Andrew Zhou.
We play the piano most of the time, and then most of the rest of the time do a whole lot of other things that we are not qualified for. But yeah, why are we doing this?
Well, I think we have an album coming out.
Oh yeah, I think beside that, how did we get here?
I think we have 2 albums coming out.
We have, yeah, I guess technically 2 albums.
Yeah.
Somehow we got it in our minds that it was a good idea to play Karlheinz Stockhausen's Mantra almost 9 years ago, or it would be at end of 2015, decided to put Mantra together and then learned it in like 2.5 months or something, performed it March of 2016. Gotten to work with some amazing people on this piece. We recorded it August 2022, have been working on edits and mixing and mastering and all the other crazy stuff that has to go into just recording generally, but also this piece specifically. We will be releasing our version of, I don't know why I had to choose my word there, our rendition, our experience of Mantra December 6th, along with an amazing collection of recent pieces, some of which were directly inspired by Mantra. Pieces by Christopher Stark and John Libertor that were written for us, sort of companion pieces to Mantra. And then this amazing collection of 7 miniatures, one by Andrew here, but also by Angus Lee, Dante da Silva, Aida Shirazi, LJ White, Chris Castro, Laura Satilia. Yeah. I felt very strongly that there was kind of a strong kinship between those miniatures, which we commissioned in 2020 as part of the Beethoven, what is it, sesquicentenary, what is 250?
That's correct.
Which was an interesting year.
Nothing happened in 2020.
Yeah,
I forgot about 2020.
We all have 2020 amnesia.
It was also an important year because it was not only the 250th anniversary of Beethoven's birth, but it was also 50 years since Mantra had been written. We should maybe talk about what Mantra is.
What is Mantra?
If you were to describe Mantra in 10 words or fewer.
Why 10? I thought you'd go for just like one word. Psilocybin. It's an epic. You know, it's up there with the Hammerklavier or the Grosse Fuge. Well, I'm naming all Beethoven pieces. I guess this is appropriate. Like the Ninth Symphony, Schubert Cello Quintet, the Art of Fugue, pieces that are just so much greater than the sum of their parts, and the sum of their parts is already great.
Or it's sort of like these pieces that you would only ever want on a program by itself. And
Right.
like you don't really need anything else. Because it's a 70-minute long piece. Mantra is a work by Karlheinz Stockhausen. It was written in 1970. The story goes he was in a car traveling through New England. By his account, the mantra just came to him, and the idea was that this tune used all 12 notes of the Western chromatic scale.
As you do.
And then as all
like-
tunes that come to us do.
It's sort of like the clean plate society. You gotta clean your plate. You gotta use all 12 tones.
Yes, everything that I dream of now comes to me in a perfect 12-tone row.
Although,
And-
didn't he also dream the helicopter string quartet?
Yeah, but that feels like a thing that is more dreamlike, in the sense that like I've dreamt about weirder things than let's play a string quartet in helicopters.
There's definitely a long tradition of sort of oniric inspiration. I think the way I learned about Stockhausen is we think of him as this part of this cadre of composers in the early 1950s who are kind of revolutionaries. The World War II, especially in the case of Stockhausen, traumatized them, and they needed to dematerialize music as much as possible, break it into its component parts, and start over with this kind of more utopic vision of what music should be. And so we think of Stockhausen as the sort of like 1950s, 1952, 1954 Stockhausen, where these pieces are incredibly like kind of algorithmic and formalistic. There is a later Stockhausen, which is this more kind of chaotic, intuitive, oniric Stockhausen, where he's trusting more his own instincts, but trusting his instincts almost to a kind of obsessive degree. It's not a passive trust of intuition. It is almost like intuition under the microscope. Mantra is this strange blend of his more intuitive music, this sense of subjective experience of material, and his formalistic music from earlier. So it's an interesting hybrid. Stockhausen writes Mantra at a time when there's a lot of changes happening in music. This is around the same time that the minimalist movement is beginning and the spectralist movement is beginning, and also the historically informed performance movement, all of which are movements that are rooted in this kind of sensual experience of sound, instruments, or of time, that everything is about the experience of being a human being living through these sounds or these physical materials. What's interesting to me about Mantra is that it kind of marks the beginning of a new era of 20th century music, certainly, but arguably 21st century music. This is really kind of the mindset that young composers are writing in now, is this idea that they have access to any kind of material they want. They can write any kind of music so long as they can organize it. And that's something somewhat new in the early 1970s. There isn't this sense of guilt or trauma about the past. There's almost a kind of joyful playfulness with sound, with music, with instruments.
Do you think he knew that he was on the Sgt. Pepper's cover? He probably, by this time he would have...
That must be written somewhere. Someone must know.
Someone must know whether he knew. So Mantra is based off of this melody that he sort of thought about, or that came to him. His whole idea was that each note in this melody would have like a constellation of the melody surrounding it. And so it's like this kind of almost fractal thing. And then the entire piece has every section that is built off of like a particular attribute that he puts on every note for the melody. Like the first note is like a repeated note. So the first section then is about repeated notes. And then there's like one section about like loud, soft. And so like the articulations there are about, in that whole section that corresponds to that is also loud, soft. So it sounds very complex, and it kind of is, but it's just kind of fractal.
Fractal.
It's just fractal. So it's this whole like universe that kind of grows out of this one seed, and that's the mantra. And I think what's very beautiful about this piece, 70 minutes long, but it's also quite clear what's going on, and there's enough sections and timbral differences and just interesting sort of dramatic arcs that happen within each section.
And interruptions. Yeah.
That I think it ends up being a pretty immersive and interesting experience.
I'd even venture to say it kind of verges on the ambient. The piece is 70 minutes long, so you go into the space and you are there for 70 minutes uninterrupted, and time just means something different.
Yeah.
And yeah, the seed crystal image, I just, evidence of how weird my YouTube algorithm is, I was recommended a short of someone dropping a rock into a pot of melted bismuth, pull the rock out, and there's this enormous bismuth crystal that comes up with the rock. It's seated on the rock. And mantra is like this gigantic crystal structure built off of this tune. So there's something spiritual in the piece, which is that in the smallest, most humble things, you find the beautiful complexities of the universe. Project what is small onto a structure that is large, and both the large structure and the small structure resemble each other. And he referred to mantra as being a work in the scale of a galaxy. You could think of every single note in the piece as being like the stars, and each of those notes are organized into solar systems, and the solar systems are in the arms of the galaxy, and then there's this however many arms of the galaxy, and then there's the galaxy as a whole, and it's this piece that's all about scale.
He does talk about the mantra having 4 limbs.
That's true,
Which kind of gives it a human character also. Yeah. I was also thinking about how, we think about these pieces that are inspired by New England, and you wouldn't think of mantra as being this very, I don't want to say it's inspired, but it came to him in the back of a car, I think, when he was leaving Connecticut, and so it's,
actually, this album, it's honoring Charles Ives.
That's really what it is. Mantra is for, instead of saying it's for 2 pianos, I think it's more accurate that it's for 2 pianists. And we have to do many other things. So I guess one of the things that we could talk about is what else we have to do when we're playing this. Because you can't just get 2 pianos together and then be like, okay, we have mantra.
This is so hard to talk about because when you actually get into the weeds, it takes forever to explain. The piece, we promise, has a simple idea at its core. That simple idea kind of explodes into this, not just one universe, but universes of complexity. We're playing piano. We're also playing racks of crotales, including 2 specially tuned crotales. Yeah, of course.
I don't even know if
2 specially tuned crotale.
Crotalus.
That sounds like a disease. We're also playing wood blocks, one of which is here, guarded by my daughter's ducky. These Japanese wood blocks that we got specially in Cologne at a store called Asian Sound, and they had stacks and stacks of these. We need 2 of them. They need to be tuned a minor third apart, so I literally went through the stacks and hit all of them. So here's another thing from Germany.
So this is
one of our Kohlberg crotale that was specially made for us. Yeah,
I think there's literally one company, that Kohlberg. that will do this, and we need 2 of these.
Yeah, there's this A sharp,
this
and
A sharp,
then a B just above it.
But the tricky thing about this is that you have to have these crotales, and it's not the fact that you have to have these crotales, but you have to put them in a very particular order. It's not just like you have a rack of crotales. They have to be arranged in a very particular way.
Specific pitches.
That each pianist has to have.
And we have different pitches, but some overlap.
Some overlap.
Our pitches are complementary to each other. Yeah, every time we've had to perform this piece, we've needed to track down filler crotale. You can hear slight pitch differences between the crotales. It's just really hard to find. And actually, for the recording,
I was gonna say,
thank you.
So
Percussion. For saving our ass. We drove down to Zhou's studio in Brooklyn, and they gave us anyway, thank you guys.
So you have to have these crotales, and you have to basically have them in front of you while you're playing. You have to have the wood blocks. Then there's this other element, which is that you need a 3rd person to be present. So let's talk about this.
Diffusionist.
So Ryan, would you like to tell us in 10 words or fewer what ring modulation is?
Psilocybin.
Just
as this piece begins with a very humble tune, that Stockhausen then explodes into the size of a galaxy. The work has this electronic processing called ring modulation that essentially acts like a sonic prism. If you could imagine, the way a prism takes light and splits it. So if you have a white light, you'll get all the various colors that are contained within white light sort of separated. You get the same with pitch. So it functions much the same way that radio broadcasting works. So when you tune into 105.5 FM, that's 105.5 megahertz. That's the carrier frequency that broadcasts the signal. Ring modulation works by combining a carrier frequency with an input signal. And the effect is that when you play one note, often you don't just hear one note, you'll hear three notes. You'll hear the original pitch and these side bands. The sound is very bell-like, called ring modulation because the original schematics for analog ring modulation had a ring of diodes. But if anyone has ever watched Doctor Who and they have heard the sound of the Daleks.
Impossible.
Doctor! Exterminate! Exterminate!
That is also ring modulation. Doctor Who started in the 60s? This is around the same time that Stockhausen is like, it would sound really cool in my piece? The Dalek voice. In every aspect of this piece, the whole idea of the piece is taking something simple and splitting it into something that's complex. The grain of sand, and this sense that the grain of sand is a universe unto itself if you sort of look at its component parts and split them apart. That's the kind of fundamental spiritual aspect of this piece, is that sense of telescoping in and out of different scales, the scale of the universal and the scale of the microscopic. Question that always comes when people hear a piece like this is like, well, God, it's just so complex and I didn't understand what was going on. Did you see the aurora?
Yeah.
We went down to the beach down here in Kingston and watched the aurora borealis. At first when we got there, it was pretty mild. Could only really see it with a camera really boosting the ISO. But then all of a sudden, the sky just lit up and just these long streamers going all the way up into the heavens. Really, it feels like heaven. These drapes from heaven. At that point, you don't understand why. You can't understand what's happening. You don't know what's happening. It's beyond your comprehension. And yet in that moment, you're willing to accept being overwhelmed by how beautiful it is. It's just beyond you. And that is, I think, the basis of the emotion in this piece. Is the structure of this piece is utterly beyond you. You don't need to understand it. You just need to know that the structure is there to create this universe of diversity, of sounds, of textures, of timbres. Yes, there is an organizing principle, and if you were nerdy enough to dive in and track it down, you could find it. Just in the same way you could understand, like, why does an aurora borealis happen? What exactly are the particles coming from the sun doing when they hit the atmosphere? Or you could look at it and be like, wow, that's the greatest shade of red I have ever seen in my life. Being utterly overwhelmed by the beauty of creation. Creation with a capital C.
Sublime.
It is the
I think
sublime.
that's the sublime, yeah.
Exactly. In the same way that Bach is sublime. You don't understand what Bach is doing. You don't need to know that there's invertible counterpoint or retrograde crab cannons going on.
Yeah.
You listen to it and you're just like, wow, that's beyond my comprehension. God is great. Whatever tradition you want to call on, it's a similar.
You're quoting Bach at that point.
Exactly, yeah.
He always say it's like for God at the end.
Stockhausen was a very spiritual composer. Around the time he writes Mantra, he's really into Eastern philosophy and Hindu mysticism, and he's reading a lot of Sri Aurobindo, who is himself kind of a hybrid Western, Eastern thinker.
If we were to go into Mantra and I were to ask, like, what are maybe one or two sections of Mantra that you think are particularly special to you? I mean, there's one that stands out. There's a moment that happens where all of a sudden we have to stand up and scream at each other.
Yeah, there's this sort of Japanese no
theater thing.
Yeah.
And that moment is probably the most overtly like slapstick part of this. And then there's also this one part, which we affectionately call the BDSM part. It grooves, and it's a little minimalistic at that point.
Which is immediately followed my favorite bit, where we actually have the least to do.
Yes.
This is actually, it's like a solo for the diffusionist, really a trio.
Yeah.
The diffusionist is the person who is kind of managing the levels of the electronics, and they are as much a part of the performance as the two of us. Both John Libertor and Chris Stark, whose pieces are on this album, have served as our diffusionists. Served makes it sound very like, they have performed.
I was thinking like...
Yes, diffusionist gets a solo, which really means that the diffusionist at this moment pushes the amplification of the pianos so close to feedback. So there are mics in the piano and there's speakers on stage, and if you push the amplification far enough, you'll start to get feedback, which generally we'd think of as a bad thing. But because that feedback is being fed through the ring modulation that the pianos are being fed through, you suddenly get this like kind of swirling nebula of craziness. Sonically, you went up into the heavens and you could just sort of swirl a nebula with your hand.
That's great way of
That's
putting it.
kind of what this section sounds like. And it's very dangerous because it can push beyond the edge of feedback and become quite abrasive. So it really is truly a virtuosic solo for the person at the mixing desk. For the recording, I had to fake it because, you know, when we recorded it without amplification in the room in order to really get a pure sound. And one of the interesting things that happened is literally in the program I was using to edit this, I had to set up this feedback loop digitally. And we think of anything that happens digitally as being like, you know, completely reproducible. And every time you play it back, it's going to be exactly the same. Well, interestingly, when I set up a feedback loop digitally, every time I played back the audio, the feedback in this section was a little different. And I think that had to do something with processor load or the heat of the computer or like something, but every time the sound of this section, even reproduced digitally, was a tiny bit different. So I literally had to do multiple takes of this section digitally in the computer in order to get exactly the sound that I thought I was going for. That's a favorite spot of mine. But yeah, the BDSM section before that,
Well,
that's kind of a solo for you.
I guess it is. And well, you're also hitting a woodblock at that point.
Yeah, I'm
it's-
whipping you to death.
You're whipping.
you
That's
know?
true.
Yeah.
But one
No
of
one
the
knows what we're talking about. Well, I'll play it in the
I
background.
mean, it's fine. I think one of the things that I just thought about with the feedback that I think is actually quite beautiful is that it feeds into this idea of like the fractal, right? It's like you have something that goes into itself and then it gets...
And fractal equations are very simple too.
I think we understand it. You
But
know, like
it's a simple idea, but
Yeah.
it produces this incredible variety of complexity that never really repeats the same way. It resembles the larger form, but the smaller repetitions of that larger form are never exact carbon copies.
There's one thing I do want to say about this section, which is that I don't think that we had gotten this section right until we went to Curtain, because this is a section that if you look at the score, it's very hard to understand what's being asked of you. And when we finally went one year to the Stockhausen epicenter in Curtin, Germany, it was not until we actually were given the privilege of working not only with Ellen Corver, who has recorded this and worked with us extensively over a week,
12 hours.
on this entire
12 hours of coaching on this
but it
piece,
it was the combination of that and having a sound diffusionist working with us.
Sound diffusionist who had performed this
performed
music
this.
knows the the tradition.
Yeah.
That's the interesting thing about the score too. The score is so detailed.
And there was like a new version of it that got published, and it contained far more information than the first one.
With the handwritten score by
score.
Stockhausen. Even with all that information, even with every single note having an articulation or a dynamic, there's more. There's more, and it has to do with the performance practice of the piece. And so, when we worked with Alan Korver and Benjamin Kobler, who had played this piece with Stockhausen, performed it with him, there was more. There was like, well, at this section it says this tempo, but actually you're going to have to do it at this tempo.
Yeah.
Or, this section with the feedback, it doesn't say feedback anywhere on the page, but it's just understood that like, well, at this point, sound diffusionist pushes the faders as high as they will go before feedback happens, and then has to pull it back strategically, and it doesn't say any of that in the score. We just had to kind of learn how to do it.
Because before that section sort of felt vaguely empty and was kind of like, it sounded like sort of a shadow of actually what it became.
We play these chords and we just like kind of wait for an apportioned amount of time. We're like,
but that was a game changer. That was something that was kind of eye-opening.
Psilocybin.
And that, and also the Morse code. There's some Morse code
as if
that shows up later on.
How many things have we rattled off?
I think we'll get to all of them.
Ring modulator.
Well, there's this kind of like Kurzwellen, which is supposed to almost have this like short wave radio kind of a sound.
And originally, it was literally shortwave radio on the stage. You bring a shortwave radio with you on stage. This is, in the 60s and 70s when there is actually more shortwave radio in the airwaves to work with. Now we would probably have a little bit more trouble getting a usable signal. But originally for the Morse code stuff, and the Morse code ties in to the ring modulation because the process by which you create ring modulated sound is the same process by which you create a radio signal and broadcast a radio signal. So Stockhausen's like, oh, what connects to ring modulation? Actual radio. So let's have actual radio in this piece. This is a kind of a Cagean moment, like imaginary landscape. You bring in radio signals, you don't know what they're gonna be. You don't know what you're going to get. It's going to be kind of chaotic and noisy, and that noisiness will kind of compete with the music that's written on the page. But originally, I think I made like a fake Morse code patch that would just kind of make garbly bleeps and bloops. And then we were given, thank you, Katinka, given by Katinka Pasveer of the Stockhausen Verlag. She gave us Stockhausen's own recording of shortwave radio, which is sort of manipulated like a tape piece, like a musique concrète piece. That's used in this recording, and it's beautiful. It just is like deliciously chaotic and gurgling, and it's like what I imagine the accretion disk of a black hole sounds like.
Yeah, there is something about trying to communicate with like outer space about it. I mean, to say that this piece is cosmic is kind of like obvious, but actually like cosmic in many ways. Like cosmic and like actually it's about almost reaching to the outer limits of the universe.
Yes, the horizontal and the vertical.
We will control the horizontal. We will control the vertical.
Yeah, and whatever 90 other dimensions that exist. Which is also to say that like working in Curtin was such an important experience for us, and just learning that this music is still an oral tradition. But I remember one of the things that was very moving, right, was the way that this music was being described in such human terms.
Yes.
Right? That it was always about having like a freshness to the sound. It was always about the music dancing and having this brightness.
I think when we think about the like kind of high modernist avant-garde, like I was saying about the early 50s, there's a sense of it being very dark. This is a music that is about the trauma of what just came before in the 1940s. And this is all music that is like impenetrable, and it's about stripping the humanity from And that's what we associate with Stockhausen. There is nothing human about this. It's like computer music. And in reality, the thing they kept saying, and I think this is the thing as you're saying, this playfulness, this kind of joyfulness, this sense of like hopefulness in the music, it's very Mozartian, they kept saying. Lustig.
Yeah.
This sort of laughing, playful, happy, joyous. It's like the laughing Buddha sort of image where you have reached such a level of enlightenment and you've worked so hard, you've meditated so hard that you have stripped your ego, that you suddenly just, everything is funny, everything is light, everything is beautiful. It's not about serious, rigorous suffering for the sake of expressing cynicism, but it is work and labor towards this kind of joyous enlightenment.
He even writes in one of the passages, he kind of puts this text that really translates to all is not so tragic.
Yeah,
you know, and
alles nicht so tragisch.
Yeah.
It's just randomly after this crazy feedback section, you're not, audience doesn't hear that, but I see it, and in that moment I am reminded that, yes, this is a joke. This is a little playful moment that is kind of just not just inserted for levity, but inserted to remind the performers, like, find the lightness and the playfulness in this music.
I remember one time when we were performing this, I had a friend in the audience who has zero experience with contemporary music or never really even learned an instrument. And I remember this is one moment when we were playing something and she just like burst out laughing. And I was like, yeah, that's correct.
Yes.
Like that's the correct response for this.
Yes.
And there's something about this piece that I think is actually so clear in its expression.
You never get just one thing for a while. Like he'll always give you like the right angle to whatever it is you're doing, just to break it up.
Yeah.
And actually something I remember Chris Stark saying years, like before we played this piece, saying Stockhausen is one of the friendliest composers from an audience's perspective. And this...
It's really true.
This
really
might
true.
strike people as a weird
really
thing
true.
to say. We're like, Stockhausen, that's just so complicated, like no one understands it. But if you think about Stockhausen as like a film director, he was brilliant at knowing exactly how much time you could spend in a given scene before you had to change your idea to something else. This idea has this much time that it can last before we're exhausted by it, and then we're going to go on to a different idea.
There's one exception to this in Mantra, and that's the brutally fast toccata ending, which I remember a composer heard us perform it and said, that section lasts way longer than you think it's going to last. And I think that's actually a very an astute observation. Basically, the entire piece gets summarized in this like 5-minute, just like no holds barred toccata, and we're just like going in all sorts of different directions, and it's hugely virtuosic.
Every note that has been played up to that point is then played in order, and it's bonkers.
And the excess of that, I think, is actually pretty genius. Like, the fact that it goes long is almost comical and, like, kind
There's
of
a theatricality
silly.
to it.
Yeah, it's like, it's so well proportioned. It's just, we've played this piece so many times now, but it's like, it doesn't feel like it's a 70-minute long piece. It just feels like you're going through all these different spaces. And like, I don't know, there is something about the proportion that I think is just so brilliant. And the fact that he wrote it so quickly and just didn't edit was just like, it really feels like it came, like he thought about it and that was like it, And I think that's quite a miraculous achievement.
And the interesting thing about a section like the toccata, where it's one idea essentially for the whole section. We're just going to play all the notes up to this point. It allows you to hear other things. And in that section, the ring modulation and the amplification is brought down. You basically just hear acoustic piano. And then as the section progresses, the ring modulation and amplification gets turned back up slowly until the very end of the section. Again, you push it to the edge of feedback. And you hear this in the recording, that it's almost like the sound has started to split its seams, and buttons are kind of bursting off, and it's overflowing this container that Stockhausen has set you up to understand. The container is playing all these notes in order, and then the sound of the two pianos and the electronics starts to bubble over that container. Through this repetition, you start to hear something else. like the cat wanted to come in here. She always does this. On the other album, the Sedgeflowers half of the album, there is John Liberatore's piece called Sedgeflowers. John is a wonderful composer. I met him at the Tanglewood Music Center.
Actually, we also met at the Tanglewood.
Yes,
Music
and
Center.
we met at the
That's kind of
Tanglewood
funny
Music
in different
Center
years. It's funny.
in
yeah.
2012. John's music is very, I mean, he even describes his work as somewhat monastic, which is to say, like, there's a certain kind of spiritual practice, meditative practice to composing where you kind of sit down and you start working and a piece starts to unfold, and there's something very Zen about John's music. So we applied with John for a Fromm Foundation commission grant to write a piece as a companion to Mantra, and he produced this beautiful piece called Sedgeflowers. And the title, Sedgeflowers, comes from a beautiful little poem by the 14th century Kashmiri mystic Lal Ded, which refers to sedgeflower as sort of a metaphor for enlightenment. Sedgeflower is just like, looks like a blade of grass, a weed essentially, which eventually gets this drooping inflorescence. Starts as something very humble, and that humble beginning becomes something very beautiful and very rich. Felt like a kind of a beautiful metaphor for the process that Mantra goes through as well. You have this humble beginning, something Stockhausen wrote on an envelope in the back of a car, that becomes this galactic scale. John's piece is also about that. A very humble start. The opening of Sedgeflowers is very simple, and yet it kind of develops into this glittering, gorgeous, shimmery piece. The other big piece on the album is Chris Stark's Forward, which was the first piece anyone wrote for us. It was meant as a prelude to Mantra. When we were playing Mantra, we would precede it with Forward, and Chris similarly took elements from Mantra, sort of specific musical motives and gestures, and wove them into the fabric of his piece, which also includes electronics. Chris's music is also very ambient, very slow in the sense that things develop slowly. It gives you time to really get to know the material, very landscape inspired. Then also on the other album is this collection of Beethoven miniatures. Fit in nicely because each of them are also kind of sedgeflowers. We use Beethoven's Rondo alla Ungherese, the Rage Over a Lost Penny, opus 129.
Felt very 2020 appropriate. Like throwaway tune, and I don't think it was even published during his lifetime.
It was written in 1795, but it's published as an opus 129.
Yeah.
It's a piece of trash, basically, as a piece. It's, fun.
It's a piece of trash. I mean, it's a really well-written piece of trash.
Totally.
It's highly entertaining.
But it has a kind of trashy character to it.
Yeah.
So all these little miniatures are inspired by this piece of trash. Each of them are super beautiful, like little gems built off of this piece of trash. And so in a way, they are each also sedgeflowers. They've sort of blossomed out of something weed-like. And so this whole first album, Sedgeflowers, or first half of the album, is this idea of taking a humble object, a humble beginning, and letting it blossom into something beautiful.
I do like the trajectory actually of this, which is that it opens with John's piece, which to me feels like it's just like a splash of cold water in kind of a good way. It's like so refreshing how it opens.
Pulls you in, and the more you listen to it, the more like complex and rich and dense it becomes. Chris's piece is very similar. The sound it starts with is very like, what am I hearing? And it draws you in, and as it draws you in, it's kind of like a black hole or something. It sucks you in to this world that is actually kind of terrifying and powerful and angular in its own sort of way.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of beautiful that it opens with John's piece, which is this multi-movement piece, and then you have these miniatures that sort of are like these little microcosms. And then Chris's piece, which is called Forward, it ends the first album and it kind of prepares you for Mantra. So, I mean, in an ideal world, you bracket out 150 minutes and you listen from the beginning to the end.
2 hours and 12 minutes, I think.
2 hours and 12 minutes.
The album is 2 hours and 12 minutes, yes.
So even less time,
Light some candles.
That's
you
right.
Light some incense. You sit down, you turn off
take whatever legal
notifications.
Substances.
Yes, exactly. Legal.
Yeah,
we
and then
encourage only legal substances.
Yeah.
And then you listen to the whole thing from beginning to end and don't even worry about understanding a thing, because we're still figuring stuff out. So we're still figuring stuff out.
We're still figuring it out.
You can figure stuff out too.
Yeah. You know, we had recorded actually the Beethoven pieces sort of at a distance. And I think that's kind of, there's another kind of beautiful part of it, which is that we actually had to set it up because we were recording it at a time when it was unsafe, or it was just not a good idea to be in the same room.
Institutionally not permitted. You know, mantra, we perform at a
You
distance,
have to be far apart.
25 feet apart. It
Yeah.
is social distance approved. These miniatures, in a way, are kind of a metaphor for that distance, because we perform them at, 3.5 hours distance and sort of stitch them together. And that was the one technical requirement I think we gave the composers, is like, by the way, we're going to be recording these at a distance. So whatever you do, it needs to be something we could do with a click track, or the parts be independent or timed with a stopwatch or something.
Is there something that you feel like in our version of mantra that you feel like you really wanted to put forth? I think one thing for me that is very notable listening to the album is that it feels to me like it's a very warm piece.
There are a lot of great recordings. It's not like this piece needs another recording, but I think part of what's amazing about performing it is that physical sensation of immersion in the sound, and part of the ethos of how it was recorded and also how it was mixed was to sort of make you feel like you're really inside the piece and inside the sounds, and like they're really kind of surrounding and enveloping you. 14 microphones. Yeah, 5 each per piano. There's like 2 close mics, 2 kind of mid mics, a crotale mic for each, then 2 overheads, and then like a center stereo. And we recorded it at a distance at Octaven Audio. Ryan Strieber is our amazing engineer for this. I don't want to say it's unique, because every recording of mantra is immersive. It has to be, but I think that the way it sounds to me when I listen to it is the way it feels to perform it. And I think that was a big goal of mine, is like what the piece sounds like in the room. It's amazing about a piece like this, just like with the Hammerklavier or the Goldberg Variations or any big piece like that, is that you see just how infinite the possibilities are, even in something that is so incredibly specific. I mean, every time we played it, it was like, oh God, I never did that before. How did I miss that detail? Or how did I miss that pedal marking? Or how did I miss that grace note? Or how did I play that like literal wrong note all this time? Or, there's so much in it. And so I don't think there's anything like that in the recording. I think
I think we covered
everything.
it. I think we've gone through it with a
There is one rhythm where I was like, oh no.
It's okay, it'll be the Easter egg. It's what makes it human.
Well, so it goes. I think that butting up of the human effort and the kind of structural ideal, the collision of those two, the fact that the human cannot ever really be that perfect form, it creates this thing in between that is ineffable and indescribable. And that's really where this piece lives, is in that in the effort to try to perfect it and never really being able to, you create something that is greater than the sum of all the parts. That's what I find attractive about coming back to it, or any big piece like that. Opus 111 by Beethoven, you'll never get it right, but the closer you get, the more rich the imperfection becomes. Oh, Jesus.
Jesus Christ. That's pretty good.
God, it's loud. I forgot how loud that is.